Jason X, Chapter 6. In Lab 1, Lowe had started to fidget. He had known that reanimating a cryo subject over 400 years old would not be a simple matter, but Jesus, how much longer was the goddamn KM unit going to putter around with the readings and the settings and the scans and all of that shit? When were they going to get this goddamn show on the street, or should that have been on the road? Shit, what the hell did he care? Street, road, it was the same goddamn difference. Right now, he could dispense with his own rule about using end-period vernacular. It paled into complete insignificance next to what he had here, along with just about any other considerations. His classes had brought back plenty of noteworthy artifacts from Earth 1, and he had the reputation to prove it. But this was several magnitudes beyond the most remarkable thing that he or anyone else had found on the long-dead home world. Nobody, absolutely nobody, had ever found salvageable life on a level of development higher than those cannibal insects. And now that he thought of it, it had been a hell of a long time since anyone had come across any of those even. Well, after today, it would probably be a hell of a long time before anyone went looking for mere bugs. Braithwaite Lowe had done what no one else could. And what he had was more than just some ragged little germ, more than a bug, more than a vertebrate even. Not just a mammal, but the mammal. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Braithwaite Lowe, heir to Columbus, Einstein, Hawking, and anybody else worth a damn, brings you the discovery of the century. From beneath the wasteland of Earth 1, a genuine pre-vac human being. No one was going to let that claim go unchallenged. Of course, so the first thing he had to do was line up all the documentation. Get the whole class on record, as well as the flight crew and the ex-grunts. Granted, as sources, Lou and Crutch weren't exactly what anyone would call impeccable, but it didn't hurt to have the working stiff represented in the credentials. Couldn't hurt at all, might even help. And no matter what pilots claimed they were working stiffs, of course, something like this meant the whole universe were just working stiffs compared to the great Braithwaite Lowe, the only man who had ever recovered a human life from Earth 1. And if KM fucked up the reanimation, he was going to rip her limb from limb and stuff the pieces up Syneron's genius ass, sideways. "Professor?" said Adrian's voice from a nearby speaker, making him jump slightly. "The specimen's cerebrum has shrunk so much that the remaining proteins make identification of the individual nerve fibers impossible." She sent a scan of the interior of the head to one of the larger display screens, so everyone in the lab could see it. "Amazing," Lowe said, still more concerned with the woman. "Well, just see what you can salvage from the optic cortex, and then move on." "My pleasure, Professor. But just take a look at the brain on this subject, will you?" "Wow, that is small," Lowe said, thinking she sounded pretty cheerful. Cheerful and alone. He hadn't heard anyone talking or moving around in the background. She had probably waited all of 2 minutes before finding some way to get Stoney and Kinsa out of her hair. "Yeah, but, how could he function with a brain that small?" Syneron said to no one in particular. "Waylander manages," Janessa said. "Oh, very funny," Waylander replied, looking down his nose at her with disdain. Abruptly, several alarms went off at once, accompanied by various flashing lights, making all of them jump except for KM, who continued working as if nothing were happening. "What's wrong?" Lowe demanded. "She's de-animating," Waylander said. Janessa consulted a panel of readouts near the head of the bed. "Damn it! The lipids in her cytoplasm are separating." Syneron was all but flitting around the room in a strangely organized flurry of activity, going from one place to another. "GTT is 59 and rising, guys." "Cam, what's her maximum limit transition temperature?" Lowe asked tensely. 80 degrees, Professor," she told him, working quickly but unhurriedly, as calm as ever. "Well, we're at 61 now and rising," Syneron added. "Is that bad?" asked Brodsky, startling Lowe for the third time in the space of a few minutes. He had forgotten that the ex-grunt team leader was still in the room. "If we don't get her lipids to retach before the GTT hits 80, she'll be a 450-year-old vegetable." "So what's happening?" Lowe asked, raising his voice. He rushed over to KM, but it was Waylander who spoke up. "Her sacrophilic levels are still at 45/200. "Queps are green," Janessa warned. Cineron pushed between Low and KM to check something on the console. Metabolic inhibitors are all in. He looked up at Janessa and then turned to Low. What about the cryoprotectant in her lymphatic system? Do you think that might have... Low shook his head impatiently. No, her potassium levels would be off the scale, Cineron. GTT is 68 and rising, KM put in calmly. The students all froze for a moment, looking at Low. Stay focused, people, he ordered them. We got a problem. You find it, and find it now. Instantly, Cineron moved around to the other side of the table. Initiating a Hex 2 charge, he announced. KM? Engaged, she said. Low looked at the woman on the table. There was no damage visible, yet, but that didn't mean she wasn't spoiling from the inside out. God damn it. Try the charge again, Cinero said. Still nothing. Waylander stepped back from the panel he had been working on and checked another display to his left. Professor? GTT passing 72, KM advised, neutrally. Lipids still falling, added Janessa, not neutral at all. God damn it, people, Low floundered, overwhelmed by the stupid alarms that kept beeping and beeping and beeping. He should have told KM to shut them all off. How could anyone think straight with all that beep, beep, beep and the goddamn flashing lights? Great emergency system they had here. The design was more conducive to giving you seizures than helping. Hey, I got it, Janessa shouted suddenly. I got it! She knelt down and made several adjustments to a small panel of controls on the side of the bed. Immediately, the alarms cut off. Lipid cohesion positive, KM informed them. Glass transition temperature 67 and fallen, Waylander said with a mixture of surprise and relief. We're in the safe level. He turned to give Janessa a questioning look. Basal core temperature was too low, she said smugly, and patted herself on the back, causing a phase separation of her lipids. Well, yeah, no shit, Cineron said, frowning. But what the hell did you do? Janessa gave a showy sigh of mock. Oh, that, she said airily. Her potassium saturation was causing the hippocampal dendrites to fire too early. Which caused the lipids to lose their cohesion, Low added as she turned her satisfied smile on him. Good catch, Janessa. She made a half bow with a little flourish. I had a good teacher. Okay, Low said. Now let's bring her up slow and steady. I had a good teacher, Cineron said, mocking her bow. Shut up, Janessa told him. Okay, Low said again, raising his voice a little. Ready on phase 2. Are we stable? Stable, confirmed Waylander. Ready, sir, KM said. Stable, Janessa sang and stuck her tongue out at Cineron. Initiating rest sequence, Cineron said, ignoring her. Kids, Low thought. All right, said Waylander. Bring on the ants. And cross your fingers, people, Low added. The ants emerged in silvery lines like strands of living metal from all four corners and both sides of the table to swarm over the motionless form of the woman lying there. In 30 seconds, they had covered her completely. They were not ants, of course, or any other kind of insects, nor were they actually visible. The silvery lines were produced by an innocuous quasi-electrical field that had no effect either on the nanomechanisms or on the process they were engaged in. The field had been added back in nanotechnology's first flush of post-breakthrough popularity, when both the price tag and ease of use had finally reached a level that made it practical enough for general use, for the sake of avoiding confusion as to whether the mechanisms were actually being deployed. It was an easy way of rendering the invisible visible without either interfering with or adding to the expense. Also, those silvery lines looked fantastic. They were aesthetically, technologically, and even intellectually sexy. Once more, science embraced art as a source of inspiration. Artistic experiments in science or scientific experiments with art produced variations in colors and patterns, although for the most part, there was no practical application for them. A few of them even rendered the nanomechanisms themselves useless. Or rather, the ants. Exactly who had first used the name ants for the nanos was long forgotten before they even left the confines of the lab for the wide-open realm of everyday human life. For all anyone knew, the name had applied itself. In any case, it wasn't really relevant. Ants they were, despite the fact that they had practically nothing in common with the originals. And ants they stayed. When you said ants, everyone knew what you were talking about. Not even the most straight-laced scientists used any other term for them. If you wanted to talk about the original found-in-nature variety, you called them anthill ants or bug ants. But those only existed in specialist terraniums, having been no match for Earth-2's native equivalent, and thus didn't usually come up as a topic, except in the most esoteric, entomological circles. Still, everyone knew what they looked like. The classic black ant was unchallenged and ubiquitous as a symbol for a nanomechanism, from children's educational cartoons to sophisticated laboratory displays, like the one Lowe was watching with concentration so intense that he kept forgetting to breathe. He knew, of course, that the ants were a graphic translation of the ants at work inside the woman's body. There was nothing to see otherwise except dense technical readouts on the various console screens and a human-shaped form in a sort of silvery cocoon on the table. Body temperature is 96.297, said KM quietly. Lowe looked over at her, and she gave a brief nod, by way of letting him know everything was fine. 98, she reported. 98.6 and holding. Lowe was finding even the graphic translation on the display hard to follow. Ants were swarming over different areas of her body, coming together in a solid mass for a few moments and then breaking apart, scattering and regrouping elsewhere. A particularly dense mass had collected in what seemed to be an incision in her middle left abdominal area. Apparently there was a lot to do, a lot of tissue to mend. The ants working there took almost as much time there as the rest of them did repairing the rest of her body. Abruptly, some of the silvery lines receded from the woman's extremities, uncovering her face, hands, and feet, but growing thicker over her body. Cell reconstruction is complete, KM announced calmly. Internal defib in 3, 2, 1. On the table, the woman's body gave a small jump, and Lowe felt his heart jump with her. Then his heart leaped again, almost painfully this time, as she opened her eyes. The sensation Rowan felt was not so much waking up or even regaining consciousness as it was coming back into existence. No memory came with it, no context for emotion, and for the first few seconds no information from any of her senses, or at least none that registered on her. For that matter, there was no such thing as those first few seconds, not in the standard way of time passing. Time itself, the very concept of duration, was coming back into existence along with her. Only, coming back from where? The question bobbed to the surface of her mind with no particular urgency. She was not all the way back yet. As soon as she was, she would know that, and a whole lot more. Knowledge, something to know in the act of knowing it, was another one of those things that, like time and herself, had been in suspension. Cryo-suspension. Immediately it was all there, complete and uncut, before her mind's eye. It was a mental movie not subject to the constraints of time or space. The former to keep everything from happening at once, and the latter to keep everything from happening to you, as famously noted in the Book of Plagues, so that she got it all immediately. The underground headquarters of the Crystal Lake Project, the long hours of demanding work to perfect the cryostasis process, despite the fact that their first subject was not exactly the epitome of fragile, Jason Voorhees. Terror spiked through her with electric frenzy before she actually had any physical sense of her body. Oh yeah, the memory might be complete and uncut, but she wasn't. Not by a long shot. As hard as she had tried to make it otherwise, the hubris of Dr. Dickhead Wimmer had doomed them all. Because he refused to concede to her expertise. Because he had refused to believe that anyone, let alone some unknown female scientist, could possibly know better than the great and powerful Wimmer about anything, especially Jason Voorhees. No one could instruct the great and powerful Wimmer, but no way, not no-how, no siree, not in this lifetime. Well, he had sure gotten his way on that one. When she had shut Jason in the cryo unit, she had thought her greatest regret, besides the loss of all those innocent soldiers' lives, would have been that the last thing Wimmer ever heard was not her voice saying, "I told you so." Changed her mind about that in a hurry, hadn't she? The force of Jason's blood lust had given him the power for a last homicidal gasp. One more for the road, so to speak. The long, icy road into deep frozen darkness. As luck would have it, it had also been a toll road, and she had had to pay the freight. Unfortunately, the cost had been her life. But she remembered now that as her eyes had closed, she had felt as much relief as she had regret, because this meant it would be over. Jason Voorhees, though unkillable, was no longer unstoppable. That had been the good news that had made the bad news of her guts oozing slowly out of the stab wound in her stomach almost bearable. If it had been up to her, she would have lived through this. No two ways about it, dying sucked. But at least she hadn't died for nothing. Except cryo unit breach lockdown in progress. Except, apparently, she hadn't died after all. Well, if that don't beat all, holy guacamole, get a load of that, will you? Can you believe this? Ain't that the damnedest thing? Will wonders never cease? As she had disappeared into the cold darkness, she had been so sure that had really been the end. Anyone still alive in the Crystal Lake facility would have run for the emergency exits without stopping even to count the corpses, much less check any of them for a pulse. After which, the government, having reviewed the surveillance recordings as well as survivors' testimony, if any, would simply order the facility to be sealed up, untouched, and as is, with the idea that containing the danger was more important than removing the dead for traditional burial. Or so she would have thought, had she lived long enough to give the matter any consideration. The surveillance footage. When the advisory board for the Crystal Lake project reviewed the surveillance footage, they must have seen what she had done and what had happened to her, and decided to recover her to see if she were viable. Cryo was still a relatively new technology, but if she had the good luck to freeze before she had died of the stab wound, her chances of survival would have been reasonably high. And wonder of wonders, good luck had been with her. She had survived not only her wound, but the still iffy process of revival as well. She lived. Jason Voorhees had not been able to kill her. Maybe that meant she was unkillable now. Maybe in the act of passing his machete through the thick steel door into her stomach, Jason had in fact passed the torch, in a manner of speaking. And then again, maybe he hadn't. Maybe he was still viable himself, despite the fact that he was several hundred feet underground frozen solid in a cryo unit cocooned in a layer of ice and frost several inches thick. Or maybe whoever had brought her out of her frozen tomb had not learned from Wimmer's fatal mistake and removed Jason as well, thinking they could do better. Her eyes fluttered open in panic. Light came crashing in on her, piercing her all the way through the center of her brain, it seemed. She felt her head roll from one side to the other. She was lying flat on her back in a very bright room, or at least one that was a great deal brighter than the murky frozen place she'd assumed would be her final resting place. A hospital? Or was she elsewhere in the Crystal Lake facility, like the infirmary? Oh God, she thought, panic rising with her level of alertness. What if they hadn't learned anything from Wimmer's incredible stupidity after all? What if they had simply restaffed and kept the Crystal Lake project going? No, she thought, squinting against the light in her eyes, trying to force them to adjust so she could see what madness she had woken up to. The blurry, watery shadows began to resolve themselves into more definite shapes. Rowan blinked, the tears away from her face fiercely, trying to find something she could actively look at, or someone. The shapes surrounding her were beginning to suggest something of human beings to her. Human faces. They were faces. As the light became less painful, her vision started to improve more rapidly. At random, she chose one of the faces on her left to focus on, and hoped she had come out of this with at least adequate eyesight. No cryo-induced macular degeneration or retinal damage. So far, so good. She could see now that the face belonged to a man. In another few seconds, she would know whether the face was familiar or not. More tears suddenly welled up in her eyes, making them sting. She blinked. They went away, and the man's face came into perfect focus. Wimmer? The cry burst out of her, a spontaneous sound of undiluted horror and outrage with the full force of herself, body, mind, soul, and instinct behind it. Panic was a pale thing compared to this combustion, which was not a process but a state of being. Rowan neither saw nor felt her hand strike the man's face, nor could she ever remember hitting him no matter how hard she tried. She realized that he was not Wimmer long before she understood why he was bent over, covering his nose with both hands and howling in pain. Heartbeats, brainwaves, BP, all showed green, someone said calmly. Vital signs are normal and strong. No shit, said the man in a muffled nasal voice. Think she broke my nose. I like her already, another person said in a stage whisper. Rowan knew immediately he was talking about her, and she decided that, whoever he was, she liked him too, or at least the sound of him. As soon as she got her bearings, she would make him introduce himself. For some unmeasured period of time, it seemed as if she wasn't going to get her bearings. Her eyes were darting from one side to another in their sockets, in a way that felt strangely compulsive. It was as if she were afraid to look at any one thing or person longer than a couple of moments, for fear that she would see, and whoever had rescued her had managed to rescue him too, and were now taking orders from him. After a bit, she found herself sitting up on some kind of firm, padded surface similar to a doctor's examination table, under the watchful gaze of 5 or 6 people. She was wearing nothing but the blanket that she was clutching to herself, something made out of a very unusual material that looked like chainmail and felt like fluffy lamb's wool, minus the itch. Nice stuff. She had never seen anything like it before, nothing even remotely like it. How long have I been down? The question stuck in her throat, too bulky to ask or to swallow, too hard to melt away. It was like being on the verge of tears while desperately trying to hold it back. And that was the only real discomfort she felt, she realized. Her head was not heavy or painful. Her joints weren't achy from disuse. Her muscles felt normal, not atrophied, not even slightly, which they had discovered was unavoidable, no matter how thoroughly a living mammalian subject had been frozen. She should have been feeling more than a little bit hungover, groggy for sure, with an acid stomach, but there was nothing wrong with her stomach, and despite her earlier feeling of disorientation, her head was actually quite clear. "Easy now," said the man she had hit. He was still holding his face with one hand, but he smoked soothingly with a tentative smile. She looked him over carefully, wondering how she could have thought he was Wimmer. The guy looked nothing like him, didn't even sound like him. Maybe she had been dreaming. It was impossible to dream in cryostasis, but there was nothing to say it couldn't happen just before waking, especially for someone who had been down a long time. So just how long have I been down? How long? How long? The question still hung in her throat, suddenly vanished, replaced by a new thought. "Did you get him?" she asked in a hoarse voice, but otherwise normal, at least to her own ears. It felt normal. But perhaps that was just some kind of illusion. Maybe she didn't sound as normal as she thought. Or maybe they couldn't even understand her at all. Otherwise, why would they all be standing around her looking at each other with open bewilderment? "Get who?" said the man with the hand over his nose. Oh God! Fear leaped in her chest. She had been hoping for yes and dreading no, but not for them to not know. Oh my God! "Then he's still out there?" she asked, feeling herself begin to tremble. Hey, shh, it's okay," said the man anxiously. "Everything's all right. There's no one out there. You're perfectly safe here." Here, which was where? Rowan took a deep breath. "Where am I?" she said finally, looking at each person. They all seemed to just be as anxious as the man, concerned for her the way good people cared about other people, even a stranger in their midst. "The last thing I remember, there was a leak in the cryo unit. Is it contained?" For a moment, no one said anything. "It is contained," the man told her after a bit. "But when the cryo unit ruptured, I'm afraid you didn't escape it. It put you into stasis too." More of the room came into focus for her then, particularly the equipment. The screens, the consoles, even the table she had been lying on. She had no idea what any of it was for exactly, or how it worked, but she understood that it was more advanced than Crystal Lake's technology, by an order of several magnitudes. While the people themselves, well, they were obviously people just like her. Only there was something about them. They were all in such good shape in a way that went beyond the matter of their physical attractiveness. "My God," Rowan said. She took another deep breath, let it out again, and made herself go on. "How long was I—" The man hesitated. "The year is 2455. His words hung in the air as if they were in the process of solidifying into a tangible object she was meant to take hold of and keep with her from now on. 2450, Rowan whispered. acutely conscious of her lips forming the words, the numbers. "I know this is a huge shock, but you're going to be safe here," the man went on. "You're aboard the Grendel. It's a Class 4 catamaran transport ship." She was aboard a what? A catamaran? That was somehow also a transport ship? It was the year 2455, and she had been thawed out on a boat? "We're on our way back home," the man was saying, "and you're going to be just fine." 2455? She tried to picture the numbers in her mind, imagining them as a digital readout, as typewriter print, as careful handwriting in fine blue ballpoint ink. In the year 2455. Nope, sorry, not that. Right idea, wrong date. Try again. That's over 400 years, Rowan said in a whisper. She must be in shock now. Who wouldn't be after finding out something like this? The man kept telling her she was going to be just fine over and over. Maybe because he was in shock too. Who wouldn't be? "Over 400 years?" she whispered, so softly now that she could barely hear it herself. Chapter 7. While the Grendel was nowhere near the largest spacecraft in active service, either military or civilian, it was one of the largest ships in its class. The catamaran designation was a bow to the ancient seagoing vessel it resembled, even though the layout served a completely different purpose. Buoyancy and wind resistance had not been considerations, of course. Personnel and cargo were contained not on, but in the two pontoon-like structures connected to the central portion, housing the bridge and engineering, along with private quarters for the pilot and co-pilot. The development of aerodynamic design had been the triumph of heavier-than-air flight, the triumph of commercial heavier-than-air flight. However, had been the development of a technique for making big spaces small and small spaces big. Technologically advanced as the Grendel was compared to the most sophisticated astronautical craft from Rowan LaFontaine's long-dead heyday, the meticulous, not-an-inch wasted layout and organization would have been instantly familiar to flight attendants from any era. A submarine crew from Earth-1 would have been even more impressed. Despite the obvious extreme differences, they would have recognized the human dynamic. Astronauts from the 20th century would have ruptured with envy. Their contemporaries, who were avid connoisseurs of space films, books, and/or games, would have been heavily critical at great length. Rowan LaFontaine was none of these things, which meant that she couldn't even conceive the irony of the situation, let alone appreciate it. The only other person familiar enough with the era to do so was Professor Braithwaite Lowe. The thought, however, never crossed his mind. He had a very clear idea of what he was looking for on these field trips, and it sure was not irony. For a while, Lowe had honestly been afraid that the psychological shock would ultimately be too much for the Viable, sending her into systematic failure. They could have resuscitated her again, but the prognosis would not have been good. Even if she came back without serious brain damage, she would be insane in a way that defied treatment. You really had only one chance with lifers, and if they went down, the kindest thing to do was let them go. Braithwaite Lowe was a friendly, even a cheerful man. He saw himself as happy, and the few people who didn't know him very well thought he was a nice man. But he was not, and never had been, a kind man. In the event of the Viable slipping into systemic shock, he had no intention of just letting her fade away. He would have put her on full life support even if she had come up brain dead, and would have arranged the best in-round-the-clock maintenance and therapy. He had recovered 2 corpuscles, an unprecedented record in itself. One, he had been forced to concede, was unsalvageable, but no power in the universe was going to make him give up the other one, no matter what. She wasn't just another of his usual exceptionally important Earth-1 recovered treasures. She was incontrovertible proof of his status as the most important human being ever. That was not megalomania, if you were rich. And God, did he need to be rich. Or more precisely, he needed to be rich again. Well, technically, he was still rich. In terms of unadorned numbers, he was rich and getting richer. The problem was, he was rich and in debt. Back when he had been poor, he had also been in debt, but that was different. It was the kind of debt familiar to all poor people, in which there is always a bill or an outstanding balance or an overdue invoice or all of the above. In that first heady flush of celebrity and affluence, he had had the satisfaction of getting himself out of debt, and he had been so rich it had seemed as though he would never have to suffer the indignity of being in debt again. No more financial embarrassment for Braithwaite Lowe, not in this lifetime. He was sure of that. However, it wasn't long before he discovered he had simply been thinking small. If being poor and in debt had been a pain in the ass, it was nothing compared to being rich and in debt. Being rich and in debt was a whole different level of trouble. It was no longer a matter of worrying over the consequences of poor credit rating or dodging bill collectors. Being rich and in debt involved sums that would get you seriously injured, even killed, or just wishing you were dead, which was a whole lot worse. By the time he was scared enough to look for serious help with financial planning, no one wanted to touch him. Advisors told him his situation was too complex, beyond their areas of expertise, and, when he became too insistent, they weren't taking on any new clients at the moment anyway. Eventually, he found his way to accountancy methods that operated in the gray areas that he now inhabited. What he found most amazing was not the degree of his own desperation, or how far down the rabbit hole it had taken him in such a relatively short period of time, but the fact that the double talk was exactly the same. Regardless of whether he was dealing with a 32nd degree CPA, whose guild ancestry was traceable back to the first generation to settle on Earth 2, the ancient guild of certified public accountants loved ritual even more than the also still extant Freemasons, or a seasoned and unapologetic fence who had been everything except an authentic bill of sale. They spoke the same language. Lowe was quick to find comfort in this, hearing the same jargon from all financial experts, legitimate and otherwise, had to mean that they were really all the same. A fence was basically an appraiser. A loan officer was a fence who didn't actually have to handle inventory. An insurance broker was a glorified bookie, and a tax collector by any other name should still be avoided. Therefore, he concluded, so-called legitimate business wasn't really all that legitimate, while supposed crooks were just trying to make a living like anyone else. Thus, it also followed that the ideal person for him to do business with was someone with a foot in both worlds, the legitimate and all the various gray areas as well. Someone who would willingly switch back and forth as necessary, because in the end, it was all just business. It was this sort of thinking that brought him finally to Dieter Perez. Lowe had known Perez for slightly over a year and had yet to see the limit of his skills or contacts. He could talk to a bank president or a crime boss with equal aplomb, dodge questions while seeming to answer them, and acquire information without so much as alluding to what he wanted to know. He was also good at finding things that had been hidden or lost, and losing anything that might prove inconvenient. Exactly how Dieter Perez had become so accomplished was a complete mystery to everyone who knew him, if anyone actually knew him. There was no evidence that anyone had ever managed more than merely being acquainted with him well enough to do business. Lowe had decided he was going to make time to do just that. He was going to find out what made Dieter Perez tick, what he had done to become the man he was today. Then he was going to duplicate it, making himself into the equivalent of Dieter Perez, which would eliminate the need for outside help in that area. That bit of streamlining would save him a lot of time and money, something that Dieter Perez himself would have approved of, obviously. Of course, before he could even begin to do any of that, he had to get his finances straightened out first, and Jesus, that was taking a hell of a lot longer than he had thought it would. Months would go by, and he would find himself no closer to even a partial solution to his problems. More often, he could count himself lucky if they didn't get any worse, and lately he hadn't been too lucky even in that small way. Things weren't getting worse with the same momentum as they had before he had found Dieter Perez, but they most definitely weren't turning around either, and time was not on his side. The night before he had left his luxury New Harvard penthouse to meet up with the class on Solaris, he had forwarded the entire contents of his inbox to Dieter Perez without reading any of it, knowing that Dieter would phone back immediately. Dieter's response was instant, as if he had already had his own inbox open when Lowe's little surprise had come in. Lowe had been fully prepared for Dieter to tear him a new one, maybe even two new ones, for deliberately violating the no-dumping rule. The first thing Dieter set down for everybody was the no-dumping rule. If you had bad stuff in your inbox that you wanted him to handle for you, you did not just send it all to Dieter. You put it in a separate drawer in your own storage and sent Dieter a key. Then he could access it without wanting and having to be in possession of it, even just virtually. If it was something bad, it was going to stay that way no matter where it was. Keeping it yourself wasn't going to make it worse than it already was, any more than sending it to Dieter could make it better. Besides, he was not in the business of providing storage space. Lowe listened as Dieter ran through a wordy paraphrase of this, including a generous amount of redundant profanity and an assortment of insults in several different languages. None of it was anything Lowe hadn't heard before, including the threats. He only began to worry when several minutes had passed and the man's vehemence showed no sign of abating even slightly. Then Dieter suddenly broke off the diatribe and erupted with a series of long, intense, racking coughs that had an unhealthy wet sound. Terrified that he had gone too far, Lowe had babbled apologies and promises even after the icon signifying that Dieter had muted him appeared in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Eventually, Dieter stopped coughing, and quite a long time after that, he calmed down enough for the more normal sort of conversation to ensue. To Lowe's relief, Dieter did not follow through on his threats to terminate their arrangements, and although he pronounced Lowe's explanation of why he had behaved like an asshole to be 10 pounds of shit in a 20-pound bag, and Lowe himself to be the exact opposite, he also spared a few words that were vaguely reassuring. But only because he knew Lowe was about to take another one of those field trips to the old homeworld. Lowe had still been nervous after he had hung up. He had been very foolish to become so dependent on Dieter Perez. Even if the guy didn't just lose it someday and cut him loose with no resources and no protection, that cough had sounded like death itself. Probably lung cancer, which was nothing serious if you kept up with it. If anyone could afford the finest in medical treatment, it was Dieter Perez. Except he hated to take time out for anything that didn't involve increasing his own wealth. He would end up putting that kind of routine maintenance off until it got serious enough to mean substantial downtime, maybe as long as 6 months, for a full in-chest regrowth. If something like that happened to Dieter, what the hell was he supposed to do? Hide out in another country under an assumed name until Dieter was back in harness? Even if he had been willing just to consider such a course of action, he couldn't have pulled it off without Dieter's help. Not that it was a reasonable alternative. It would mean giving up everything, not just the lifestyle to which he had become accustomed, with all its perks and benefits, but his career, his status, his name, and any hope of ever getting any of them back. He would have to remain hidden in a menial life with minimal comforts, where the best he could hope for on any given day was that absolutely nothing would happen. What the hell kind of life was that? It was no life at all, really. He'd have been better off letting the debt collectors cut their losses by selling him for parts. But now all those worries were in the past. After this trip, he would never have to worry about being rich and in debt again. A find like this meant he was never going to run out of money or anything else he wanted. Of course, he was going to follow his original plan, to spend less and invest more, choosing the safest options he could find, even if they were slower to pay off than the higher-risk stuff. He would make sure he had a safety net, although he wasn't going to turn into a miser either. He wouldn't have to deny himself anything he really wanted. No point to that. After all, you couldn't take it with you, right? All of this had been spinning round and round in his mind while he and the others had been monitoring the newly revived woman, trying to minimize the shock to her mind and body while making her as comfortable as possible. The ants had been designed to stimulate endorphin production and then enhance the effects while they worked for the sake of counteracting trauma. As a result, most people got up off the table and walked away feeling good as new, if not better, even after something as massive as a total body reconstruction. But the woman they had thought out hadn't seemed to respond quite as well. Apparently finding out you were now over 455 years old was more of a shock than the ants could deal with. KM had administered a little extra medication, and that appeared to keep her anxiety from getting any worse. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to decrease it very much, if at all. Then she had grown tired of all of a sudden, and before Lowe could even tell Brodsky and Cineron to take her to one of the spare passenger cabins, she was fast asleep. Probably the best thing for her. KM had said this, and no one had been inclined to argue about that. Perhaps because they were all tired themselves, Lowe thought. They certainly looked as if they needed a nap. He certainly could have used one, but his fatigue was mixed with restless excitement, and he knew that if he actually did lie down, he wouldn't be able to close his eyes. Because this was the big one, the biggest of big freaks, and he was too tired to sleep, too excited to think, and too close to heaven to slow down now. After making sure the surveillance in the woman's cabin was set on continuous, and it would page him as soon as she woke up again, he had told the students to take a break, and then, barely sparing a thought for Adrian hard at work in Lab 2, he headed for his own quarters at a dead run. He couldn't wait to see the look on Dieter's face when he told him about his find. Dieter wasn't just going to shit. Dieter was going to shit pears, and then pineapples, followed by bananas, coconuts, and those weird purple mutant strawberries that were the latest designer fruit craze. Dieter was going to shit an entire cornucopia, and then, in honor of Lowe's course, which was directly responsible for this good fortune in the first place, wild monkeys would fly out of Dieter's butt, and Lowe would award a summa cum laude to every student who identified the reference. And they would all live happily ever after. "Secure line," Lowe said into the console microphone on his desk. The built-in screen lit up with the go-ahead for voice commands. "Perez, Dieter, Solaris Research Station, connect." Using a secure line always meant having to wait a few extra moments. He tried to be patient while the call went through, but it seemed like a week before the screen finally changed to show him the unshaven, rumpled features of Dieter Perez, whom he had obviously just woken up. Immediately, he zapped all the pertinent data on the find, making sure that it would open in a new panel on Dieter's screen. Frowning, Dieter blinked groggily at him, as if he were having trouble remembering exactly who Lowe was. Then his eyes seemed to refocus. "Lowe," he said in a rasp that had only slightly more gravel in it than when he was wide awake. "Lowe, you bastard!" Lowe folded his arms and sat back in his chair, waiting for him to notice the extra data he had sent. "Dieter, this is your official notification. We have hit the motherfucking load." Dieter barely glanced at it. "Do you know what time it is here?" he asked grumpily. "Just because Solaris is an orbiting city doesn't mean we don't have day and night here, jerk." "We're 6 parsecs away," Lowe said dismissively. "How the hell do I know what time it is there? Didn't you hear what I said? We just hit a gold mine." Dieter made a disgusted noise and wiped a wrinkled hand over his face. "Lowe, you bastard! A box of DVDs is not a gold mine. I told you, I can't move them." "Just look at the file, will ya?" Lowe snapped. Dieter gave him a poisonous glare, but did as he was told. Damn, he was looking rougher than usual, Lowe thought as he watched for some reaction. Good thing he had made this find now. This time next month, Dieter could be zipped into a body bag for one of those last resort overhauls, the kind where they didn't guarantee you'd come out again. After a bit, Dieter looked up at him again, raising one eyebrow, in a question. 2 400-year-old frozen specimens, Lowe said, just in case Dieter was still too sleepy to make sense of anything. One well-preserved, and one, I'm not shitting you, up and walking around. Dieter nodded. 400-year-olds and walking around. His voice was expressionless as his face. 445 years to be exact, Lowe corrected him proudly. And who gives a shit? Said Dieter. Who the fuck cares? People, Lowe replied, barely managing to keep from adding, you total moron. People will pay huge money to see her. They will. She's a medical anomaly. There's nobody like her. Let me ask you a question, Dieter sighed. Is this the first person you ever reanimated? No, of course not, Lowe said, feeling slightly offended now. Was Dieter playing mind games with him? The time he had spent working in medical rehab on an interdisciplinary fellowship was a matter of public record, and he always made sure that it was mentioned in every single article written about him. And how many other people are out there today walking around thawed out and looking good? Dieter asked. Well, Lowe grimaced with irritation. Hundreds, but thousands, Dieter said, talking over him. All right, maybe, Lowe said quickly before he could go on. But none of them are 445 years old. This woman is nearly twice as old as anybody alive. Dieter rolled his eyes. 250, 450. There's no difference, Professor. Not to your average citizen walking around with them. 100 years ago when reanimation was more unpredictable, sure. Great big fucking deal. Alert the media. But now it's just old news. Lowe leaned forward and looked into the screen urgently. But old news, Dieter said again, regarding him through his very baggy, half-closed eyes. Lowe knew that look. He had seen it before. It meant any further talk on his part would be a waste of breath. But I need money, he whined. I know, said Dieter with mock sympathy. He seemed about to break the connection and then paused, looking at something else on the screen. This other viable of yours is marked Voorhees. That wouldn't be Jason Voorhees, would it? It was Lowe's turn to blink in surprise. Yeah, it is. Who's Jason Voorhees? Only one of the most famous murderers ever, Dieter told him. He killed something like 200 people and then simply disappeared without a trace. His voice had warmed up considerably, and his expression was no longer bored or annoyed, but interested. Goddamn, Jason Voorhees. My God. To the right buyer, he could be worth a fortune. A fortune. Lowe's heart gave the same kind of intense, painful leap as it had when he had seen the woman's eyes open. Fortune was not one of those words that Dieter just threw around in casual hyperbole. Dieter's idea of a fortune was what other people would have defined as wealth beyond imagining. It was all he could do to keep from kissing the console screen. Is that so? He heard himself saying. How much of a fortune? Dieter gave a short laugh. Enough to keep us in whiskey and ladies until your liver rots and our peckers fall off, you asshole. What do you think I mean? I said a fortune. You want me to clarify that for you? Okay, a large fortune. And I got him frozen right here on the ship, Lowe said, grinning broadly. Uh-huh, Dieter said warily. Have you worked up a list of ownership yet? No list, Lowe informed him in a tone suggesting he was surprised that Dieter had asked. He's my find. He's mine. Mine. Dieter chuckled, though it sounded more like one of those scary liquid coughs than laughter. But what about your students? Lowe made an airy gesture. They're students. The educational experience is enough. It's more than enough. They got to go to Earth One with the famous and distinguished Dr. Lowe. Another one of those ragged liquid chuckles. Doctor, you're one son of a bitch. Dieter's highest accolade. Lowe felt quietly proud. Uh-huh, and soon to be one rich son of a bitch. Lowe out. Just as he disconnected, the door buzzed. He okayed entry from the console and turned around to find Janessa standing in the open doorway with an expression of dirty mischief on her dewy young face. She had a bottle of champagne in one hand, and one of Lowe's all-time favorite items of pleasure in the other. And the blouse she had been barely wearing all day seemed about to come off. Professor, she said sweetly, I think we need to talk about my midterm. It was his responsibility as a teacher to be available to his students whenever they wanted his help or guidance. Lowe thought this as he got up from the console. Okay, this has been chapters 6 and 7 of Jason X, the novelization of the movie. And I gotta say, guys, as much as I've been enjoying this book, tonight it felt like it was just every word that I read could have been the word filler. And I hate to sound that way, but it seemed like everything that happened in these past 35 pages could have been covered in like 10 pages. That's just my opinion. I'm still enjoying the book, and I look forward to seeing how it plays out parallel to the movie, what's different, what's the same, stuff like that. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section, and I'll be back later with some more of Jason X. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, and